Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I sound really cavernous. This is all right, Keith? All right, good. Thanks for being here. We usually meet in the recreation room across the hall. This is an easier setup for the crew here at Westminster. I imagine this is a pretty informal discussion of literature, and all of a sudden walking in this morning I realized this is a much more formal setting, and the room makes it feel much more important perhaps than the topic, but I'm glad you're here, and I'll try to raise my game to match the room and the space and all of that. But the echo in here just makes me feel how big the room is. But thanks for being here. This is the first session of 3 that we're doing here in June called After the Newer Testament. If you've been a part of adult education programming the last 2 years, you might sense why we're here now. If you haven't been as engaged as others, that's perfectly fine. 2 years ago, approximately, Margaret Fox and I started a series on the Older Testament, and we literally ran through the various books of the Older Testament. And then last summer, we thought, well, maybe we should talk about what happens in between the Testaments. So I did a short series on Jewish literature after the Older Testament, prior to the birth of Jesus. Then this last year, Margaret and I, not quite ran, but we jogged through the Newer Testament. It's a shorter collection of books. And now here we are. We thought, well, of course, we should just keep going. And so we're going to talk about what came after the Newer Testament. There's no implicit promise here to keep doing 2,000 years of Christian literature, but you never know. But what I want to talk about for these 3 weeks is just basically, well, what happened? We talked about how these books got put together. We spent a lot of time focusing on how the Newer Testament writings do not all have the exact same perspective. We get a diversity of kinds of literature. We get a diversity of different opinions about who Jesus is and why he matters. There's more literature out there than is included in the Newer Testament, and so we want to talk a bit about some of that. And I want to talk about how these books got pulled together into a collection that we now call the Newer Testament, which is part of course, the Christian Bible. And what we're going to see today is there's a lot of literature that's out there, and it's a little ridiculous for somebody to promise that he can summarize it in about 55 minutes now, but that's what I'm going to try to do today. Today I want to kind of lay the groundwork for what are some of the other pieces of literature that are there, that exist, that we know about. And then next week we're going to talk about the formation of a Christian canon, or a collection of writings that became the New Testament, like who decided these books. And then in the third week, 2 weeks from today, on the 22nd of June, I'm going to talk about, you're going to listen. No, we'll talk together about kind of this bigger so what questions. What does it mean to have a Bible whose contents are fixed or that are set? And how does that affect the way we talk about the Bible, or what we understand the Bible to be? Sometimes that word canon sounds like a very heavy word, right? Even thinking about what else canon can mean, right? It's a homophone for, another kind of a weapon. But what does it mean when we talk about the New Testament canon, or the New Testament collection? So that's where we're going. I do imagine this as somewhat kind of casual. The slides aren't as pretty, and the literature is a little more weird. But this is important stuff to know, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about some of this literature and about some of this history. But first, an announcement. There's going to be a summer book read this summer. We're changing up in some ways how the book reads around here have been done. And so we're going to do one in July 13th and 20th. The book is Heaven and Earth Grocery Store by James McBride. You can participate in person. There'll be groups in person here those 2 Sundays to talk about the book. But if you are remote, instead of using the live stream, it will be on Zoom, so you can actually have a conversation, so you can be interacting with people in real time. More information will be released about that in Westminster News, I believe, and Margaret also has more information if you want to ask her. The expectation is hopefully you would read the book, or as much of the book as you can, prior to the 13th, so that you can talk about it. I hear it's a great book. That's all I know, though. A few nods. Excellent. All right. After the Newer Testament, then. So I like timelines, as you might have known from seeing this before. This is not a graphical timeline, but mostly a list to kind of help orient us. We can date the death of Jesus roughly around the years 30 or 33, give or take a few years. There's just It's hard to nail anything down with precision when we're talking that long ago. Roughly between the years 50 and 120 is when the various books, the 27 books that are included in our Newer Testament, this is the period in which they were written. Nobody sat down and said, I've been commissioned to write something for the New Testament, I better get to work, right? They just wrote books, and it was later that these books were deemed worthy enough or fitting enough or useful enough to be included in the New Testament. But I want you to notice roughly this takes place within a generation or two after the death of Jesus. Most of the documents in the Newer Testament were written by the year 100, so in that 70-year period. The Apostle Paul is writing between 50 and 58 or 50 and 60, roughly, at least the letters we have from him come from about that period, we think. The Gospels, more debate about that, roughly between 70 and 90 or 70 and 100. The Gospels appear to be taken from what were already oral traditions, right? Remembrances about Jesus that were being told and retold as well. So we have these writings that are relatively proximate. I mean, they're close by in time to the life and death of Jesus. Some of them written by people who claim to have seen him or who are relying on the testimony of people who had seen Jesus. So just to kind of get a sense for where those books reside. But we don't have any books that were written like during the time Jesus was walking around. Like we don't have stenographers' notes or anything like that. We don't have people sitting down a week after the original Easter and saying, here's my memory or here's my diary. What we have are later recordings of traditions. I'm jumping ahead a lot in time here, but another really important date, in the year 313, the Edict of Milan. This is when the Emperor Constantine formally declared that Christianity is now a protected religion within the Roman Empire. So in a sense, this doesn't exactly bring an end to it, but in a sense, this is the legal end to persecution of Christians. Christianity, the Christian movement, the church, now has imperial protection and also some imperial patronage. In other words, Constantine starts funneling money toward the church. Whether you like that or not, whether you think that resembles, maybe this is where Christianity took a left or right turn and, into trouble. All sorts of opinions about that. But for the most part for today, 313 marks a particular period where the production of Christian literature, the collecting of Christian literature, and just the survival of and the security of Christian literature really changes quite a bit because of this imperial move. I also want to add one more date, and that's roughly around the year 400, the late 4th century, the creation of the Vulgate. The Vulgate, you're going to get a lot of weird words today. The Vulgate is the Latin translation of the Bible, or the translation of the Old and New Testaments into Latin. Project headed up by somebody named St. Jerome, if that name's familiar to any of you. Why is that significant? Because once the Bible is translated into Latin, at least in the Western world, in the Roman Church and areas around that, pretty much nobody looks back, right? These are our books. We have them in Latin now. We're going to read them in Latin. We have this church structure, this leadership structure, this priestly structure of people who will know Latin all throughout the Middle Ages, and they will, in a sense, be the holders of these books. In other words, this is a date where the discussion of what belongs in the Bible or what doesn't belong in the Bible is essentially settled, at least for the churches in the western part of the Roman Empire. Does that kind of help? So we're talking about a huge period of time that is taking place here. Our focus today is going to be mostly on literature from the 2nd century, from the 100s, if that kind of helps you put things into a place in your own mind. Some things are going on during this period. During the 2nd century, there's a lot of things that are kind of producing ideas within the church or producing crises within the church. And here are maybe the two important ones. The first is something called, kind of politely, the parting of the ways is taking place. We talked about that a little bit last year. This is the pleasant word historians use to describe the gradual distinction between Judaism and Christianity. Right? How do these two, what we now understand as two separate but related religions, how did they start to understand themselves as no longer the same, right? They aren't worshiping together, they don't have the same beliefs. It's impossible to belong to both communities at the same time. There was never a meeting decided where people said, we're going to separate the ways. Rather, this is a gradual and in many ways painful and acrimonious division that starts in the first century but really accelerates in the early second century. And there's a revolt in Judea that's referred to as the Bar Kokhba revolt. We sometimes talk about a revolt that happened in the years 66 to 70 when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. Here's a second revolt that happens in 132 to 135. And as a result of this, the Roman Empire clamps down really, really hard on Judaism. In the year 135, the Romans expel all Jews from Jerusalem. They change the name of the city. There's a temple that's built there to Jupiter. And Judaism is in many ways forced to kind of reorganize itself in terms of its teachers, in terms of its teachings, and becomes in many ways landless, right? Becomes in many ways dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. And a lot of Jews and a lot of communities become really suspicious in the eyes of a lot of Romans. This is another reason why the church now wants to separate itself, right? Wants to move apart in some ways because of the dangers of being too closely associated with Judaism. Anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism is not necessarily a modern thing. It's not necessarily a Christian thing, right? It was there before Jesus' followers came along, and in many ways the Roman Empire accelerates that. You also have in the second century, around the years 150, right, middle of the 100s, a variety of expressions of Christianity that are eventually judged by many others to be heretical. And that word heresy is always a fun word to toss around. And here are three of the big ones: Montanism, Marcionism, and Gnostic teachings. Again, more fun words to toss around at your barbecue tonight. Montanism is named after a man named Montanus, who was a Christian teacher, but also claimed to have had visions, and very much a kind of visionary, spiritualized, kind of charismatic form of religion that made a lot of people very uncomfortable because Montanus claimed to be receiving direct revelations, and the rest of the church was a little concerned about that. Marcionism. Marcion was a teacher, follower of Jesus, who claimed that Jesus was not the same or not necessarily connected to the God of the Older Testament, but was, in a sense, kind of a new deity, a new God. And so Marcion believed in a strict break between Christian faith and Judaism. In other words, thought the God of the Old Testament was violent, was vindictive, and Jesus comes now to reveal a brand new God. You might think there's something appealing about that. Hopefully, in our Old Testament series 2 years ago, we put to bed some of those suspicions. But Marcion was somebody who very much was ready to jettison all of the church's Jewish past. And others in the church fought back against that and said, no, Jesus was a Jew. We have a connection to all of the stories of the Older Testament. Those are part of our scriptures. There's not a clean division between the God of the Old and the God of the New. The Gnostics, this is crazy to try to talk about the Gnostics in like 5 minutes, but there were forms of philosophy in the first century that were quite popular in some circles that were based on this idea of knowledge being either salvific or being enlightening. I want to describe this in a way that doesn't make it sound necessarily New Agey. Remember New Age stuff in the 1980s? Remember anybody? You remember the 80s? Okay, good. This crowd, I can talk about the 80s. With my students, they just, they drift. The belief was that one of the problems humanity suffers under is a lack of knowledge about its true divinity, about its true inner divine spark, right? And so for humanity to become fully enlightened required people to discover this kind of hidden truth that's buried within everybody. This is a form of philosophy. It comes out of some of Plato's teachings that get changed and reworked throughout the history of Greek philosophy. It finds its way into some Jewish expressions of faith as well, but it also finds its way into some Christian expressions of faith. And so there are Christian teachings and Christian documents among followers of Jesus Christ who also were influenced by this Gnostic way of teaching. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which is the Greek word for knowledge. When I say it's Gnostic teachings, these are things that talk about knowledge as being salvific. This is really painting with a broad brush, but some Gnostic Christians believe that what made Jesus, what it meant to be saved or what it meant to participate with Jesus is not necessarily to have your sins forgiven or to be promised eternal life, but it's to recognize through Jesus this divine spark that exists within all of us that we've lost. And so what makes Jesus a savior for a lot of Gnostic Christians in the 2nd century was not that he came from God or that he became human. At least some of these Gnostic writings said that he was not human. There's one, I didn't put it up on a slide, it's lovely. It talks about how he didn't digest his foods. He only ate, but he never went to the bathroom. There's literally a treatise about this. As a way of saying Jesus was not human like you and I were human, right? He was really this expression of divinity. He was this kind of embodiment of divine knowledge. And the way you participate with Jesus is to recognize your kind of family relationship that you share with Jesus. So again, a different expression of Christian faith, and there are significant back and forth, fights, right? Quarrels between different kinds of Christians that are taking place in the 2nd century. I'm just going to ask Margaret really quick. Could you run into the rec room and just direct people who are trying to get into the, trying to make this subtle, not embarrassing for anybody. So anyway, this understanding of Jesus as being this carrier of and this teacher of a divine wisdom or divine knowledge. So a lot of these Christian writings are, again, going back and forth, but we also have a lot of Christian writings that express some of these Gnostic ideas that help us understand what different Christians were thinking and believing in the 1st century. What kind of documents exist? There are literally hundreds that we have or that we know about in some way, shape, or form, and this is a really rough summary. We have some letters. We've got letters that people wrote to churches, just like Paul wrote to churches. There's a bishop of Rome who wrote a really important letter. There's another bishop in a place called Smyrna, which is in western Turkey today, who wrote a really important letter. So we have other Christian teachers who are writing letters to far-off churches. Some of those have survived. We have treatises and sermons, right? Just good old-fashioned theological writings that people have left. We have scriptural interpretation that has survived. Some of it really strange, really allegorical, like who's kind of saying it's not really about this, it's about that. People who are interpreting the Old Testament and the New Testament. Oh, we have legends. We'll look at some of these as well, things that try to fill gaps in certain stories. The Gospels in our Newer Testament only talk about Jesus being born. There's one reference to him being 12 years old, and then he's an adult. What happened for those 30 years? You've got some documents that try to fill in those stories, some documents that try to give us more information about Mary, for example, and the birth of Jesus. Apologies. This is not people saying, I'm sorry for being a Christian. The word apology means a defense. We have some people defending Christian faith against its opponents, sometimes Jewish opponents, sometimes Roman opponents. So we have this polemical writing, right, from some people who are saying, everybody who believes that is an idiot, everybody who believes this is blessed, right? So we've got a lot of writings that show us some of the battles that are taking place. Thank God the church has moved beyond that, right, that form of talking, and we all agree. I did have a student once who said in my New Testament class, it's really good to be studying the Bible. I'm so excited to learn just kind of a simpler Christian faith back when everybody got along and believed the same thing. And I said, I've got some really bad news for you. Right, as far back as we can look, right, this is what we've got. Sheila.
Some of the movies that we have about Christ.
Yeah, so the question was, we still are doing this, right? We still are filling the gaps, whether it's with film or other things, even fiction, right? I don't know if that would eventually become doctrine, but it's interesting. I imagine people will look back on like a Jesus film, right? Or what's the series that's out right now? The Chosen or something like that. People will look back on that and say, this doesn't necessarily tell us more about the life of Jesus. This tells us a lot about what people in the 21st century were thinking about Jesus. You know what I mean? What questions did they have? Why were they portraying him in this particular way? Exactly. So like a lot of those documents, I would say, don't really give us any reliable historical information about Jesus, but they sure tell us a lot about the kinds of things people were fussing about or worrying about and wondering about. Historians like to say that tradition abhors a vacuum. In other words, whenever there's like an opening, whenever there's information we don't know, a lot of time tradition tries to fix that or answer that. We'll see some stuff later on today which gives rise to certain Catholic teachings about, for example, the perpetual virginity of Mary or the sinlessness of Mary. The Bible never talks about that, but this comes about through the church wondering, right? Could Jesus' mother have been sinful just like us? Or did Jesus have to come from a more kind of purified mother or not? I mean, that kind of wondering comes because a tradition is trying to figure out how do we get from A to B, right? In a lot of ways, our Jesus films and things like that do similar things for sure. There's also other gospels. I put gospels in parentheses, in quotation marks there, because not all of them look like the kinds of gospels we're used to seeing. Not all of them are narrative, for example. Some of them are just teachings. Some of them are just more like a treatise as well. There's hundreds of documents out here. I'll tell you where you can find them in a few minutes. But is there any ancient Christian literature you've heard about? If your answer is no, you're probably in good company. This is not stuff that often a lot of people read. Every now and then, Dan Brown writes the Da Vinci Code and people get all excited about things, or you hear about a new gospel. Back when people read magazines, it used to be in Easter, Time or U.S. News and World Report would always have like the secret gospels on the cover at the checkout stand, and any books or things you might have heard about? Augustine, did you say? So Augustine, you've got a Christian author, Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient literature. That's Jewish literature, not Christian literature, but still very important for setting the stage, but yeah. So Nag Hammadi texts, again, an important word. This is a collection of texts that was found in an Egyptian city called Nag Hammadi. Somebody found a library, right? A bunch of texts there that tell us a lot about those Gnostic movements in particular. Against heresies, there's a great, you can tell from the title of that, right, what kind of a book that is. It's a mid-2nd century, around like 160, 180, I think. Good, you've got a lot to read then, a lot to learn about. This is great. A few things to consider, and then I want to look at some of these texts. How we know about a certain book matters, right? Sometimes some of the books I'm going to talk about, we have existing copies that have survived a long time. Sometimes we don't know the books, but we have other people who quote the books. Does that make sense? We know of some books. There's something called the Gospel to the Hebrews, which does not exist. Nobody knows what it is, but we know about it because some people in the 2nd century were mad about it. And they talk about this horrible book called the Gospel to the Hebrews. And sometimes they might even quote a few passages from it. So sometimes we hear about things in that way. Sometimes we do have extant copies. There are some of these books that are anonymous. A lot of these books I'm going to talk about are just anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. Some of them carry the name of a famous person who probably did not write it. But some of them we do know who they came from. You'll sometimes hear people talk about the church fathers. Like, that's a pretty male name. Well, it's this collection of writings that come from the 1st and 2nd century. The authors appear to all have been men. But these are writings that come from people who might have known some of the apostles, might have lived at the same time of some of the apostles. There's a man named Clement of Rome. He was a church leader in Rome. A man named Polycarp in Smyrna who knew Paul, it appears. Ignatius of Antioch. I don't know if anybody has a place in their head for these names. And some other texts. So there are some that come from people we know. Once we get into like the 3rd century, 4th century, also from people we know. So Augustine was mentioned. There's a man named Origen who lived in Alexandria who wrote a lot and some very interesting stuff. A man named Irenaeus wrote Against Heresies. If you want to read about all the heresies you're not supposed to believe in, you can read Irenaeus later today. Also, one thing that matters is where or how a document is discovered. Did an archaeologist find this buried somewhere and can figure out what else is laying around it, right? We can tell what period of time it comes from. Did it come from a worship space? Was it found in a trash pile? This is very different from when somebody says, hey, an antiquities dealer sold me this document, here it is. A lot of the antiquities trade these days has become so profitable that more and more old documents are showing up through private traders as opposed to archaeologists. This sounds like a snobbish thing for me to say, but Without knowing where it was discovered, how it was discovered, we lose a whole lot of information about its context, potentially, right? Potentially. So this is kind of part of what's going on. Also, was it ever translated? If we find a document that was translated into 2 or 3 different languages, what can we assume about that? Popular, right? It traveled. Different kinds of people either wanted to read it or somebody wanted a variety of people to read it. If we find one document that's really weird in a pile with a lot of other really weird documents, we don't find it anywhere else, that might say something about it not being super well received. We don't know. But if we find a document in a variety of places around the Mediterranean in a variety of languages, that might indicate this document had some traction. So how widely a distributed book was matters. Whether a book converges with teachings in other books matters, right? Can we kind of figure out who the teams were, so to speak, right? Who were the groups? Who fits kind of this category of belief? Who's more in kind of that category of belief? In some ways, we did some of that, Margaret and I did, when talking about the Newer Testament, right? We see ways in which Paul influenced people. We see ways in which the Gospel of John and some of its symbolism might have influenced other writers. All right, good time for a quick break. How are we doing? Lost anybody? We've covered a lot of centuries. Jennifer? Oh yeah, we have a microphone which helps the folks on the live stream for sure.
I have a question which comes from my own specialty. I've never thought of this before.
Yeah.
Was there, I mean, how were these things preserved? Because I know in my field, history of science, a lot of things were preserved by Islamic groups that gathered like the writings of Aristotle, and then those were rediscovered in the medieval period by Europeans who had gone to the Middle East, and they found them in those kind of copies. Was there a similar sort of Islamic gathering of some of these texts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know enough to answer that super confidently, but correct, right? A lot of Islamic communities basically preserved a lot of classical Greek knowledge. Some of this I know about because some of these books showed up in codices, in books, literally bound books that we have from like the 4th century that have Christian scripture in them as well. So that's helpful in some ways. Some have shown up in various monasteries, which would suggest they've been passed along. I mean, I can think of some. The one I'm about to read a segment from, I believe somebody had already, a scholar had already surmised it existed from the ways in which he saw other authors quoting it, and when it was finally found in a monastery, it was like vindication of an entire career, you know what I mean? Like, aha, I knew it. But I think they're mostly coming through church groups that are very, very old and old libraries. Some of these are being found in ancient libraries, like the Nag Hammadi texts that were mentioned were literally found like the Dead Sea Scrolls because somebody was lucky enough to unearth a bunch of jars that held scrolls and things. I'd have to look up about the connection between Islamic communities. All right, I want to show just a couple of examples of some of these texts so that maybe to demystify them or maybe to make them a little more interesting in some ways. So I've just got about 8 different documents. I've tried to limit this to things that talk about Jesus or that talk about kind of Christian worship in general. One very interesting document is referred to as the Didache, and Didache is the Greek word for teaching. So the full name of this document is The Lord's Teaching Through the 12 Apostles to the Nations. They needed an editor, right? So the Didache has a lot more zing to it. Roughly around the year 100, it's anonymous, but it gives us a glimpse into the liturgical life of early churches. It's basically saying kind of this is how churches ought to worship. I love this concerning baptism. Baptize this way. Having first said all these things, that's the previous paragraph, baptize into the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit in living water. What's living water? Yeah, fresh water, right? Flowing. So Jews have a deep tradition about living water for their rituals as well. So it has to be rainwater or like river water. So they got this from Matthew 28, right? But we also still use this in our liturgy. But if you have no living water, baptize into other water, right? And if you cannot do so in cold water, do so in warm. So willing to compromise. But if you have neither, pour out water 3 times upon the head into the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. But before the baptism, let the baptizer fast, and the baptized, and whoever else can. But you shall order the baptized to fast 1 or 2 days before. So it has these rules, right? Which, again, we still make rules about things. We have a book of order in the Presbyterian Church that isn't quite this detailed, but has some details for sure. One thing that's interesting about this book, in its discussion of the Eucharist, of the Lord's Supper, it talks about just like bread comes from grain that's been on all different hills and comes together into one loaf. Does that sound familiar to anybody? There's a hymn that uses that exact same imagery, right? As the grains of wheat, so scattered on the hill, something, something to become one bread. You know that song? Trust me. Well, it's Community Sing Day, so all of our singers are in the sanctuary right now. But, pardon me? No, I'm not going to sing it. Yeah. Not going to do it. Yeah, I just can't. Yeah, just can't. I have nightmares about being asked to sing in front of crowds. So there's that. It also has, if you read the Lord's Prayer in Matthew's Gospel and in Luke's Gospel, it's missing the very last line, right? For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. That's in the Didache. So the Lord's Prayer that we use, most churches use, is a combination of Matthew's version, Luke's version, and then this one clause or this one sentence added in from this early Christian document that was never put into the Bible, which I just find kind of interesting, right? It's stuck around. So there you have it. So some of this book remains active in our traditions, like the Lord's Prayer and language around the Eucharist. So you didn't even know it, but you've recited part of the Didache in church. The Shepherd of Hermas. You're like, what in the world? It's written apparently by somebody named Hermas. And this is a book that is in many ways an allegory. It's a description of a variety of visions, also roughly around the year 100. If we were to make a list of the 27 books in the New Testament and then say, okay, what's the next one that could have been included maybe? It could have been the Shepherd of Hermas. In other words, a lot of early Christian writers quote this book and seem to regard this book very highly. There's nothing like scandalous in it, but it is a little odd from place to place. It's a bunch of these allegorical visions with a lot to say about sin and repentance and the need to bear fruit. So if you come from a stream of Christianity that's very preachy and very concerned about sin and making you feel guilt, be glad that you didn't get the Shepherd of Hermas dropped on you, because Hermas is very burdened by his sin. But he has this vision of an elderly woman, and he's trying to figure out who it is. So he says, a vision was made unto me, and this is, this is an archaic English translation, right? It's the easiest way to cut and paste these is to use other people's old translations that are now in the public domain, so apologies if I sound like I'm King James for a moment. A revelation was made to me in my sleep by a youth of exceeding fair form, in other words, a really good-looking guy, who said to me, whom thinkest thou the aged woman from whom thou receivest the book to be? I said, the Sibyl, right, some divine messenger. Thou art wrong, said he, she is not. So who is this elderly woman, right? Who and is she, I say? The church, saith he. I said to him, well, wherefore then, why is she aged? Because, saith he, she was created before all things, therefore she is aged, and for her sake the world was framed. So subtle here, right? But here's this statement saying, this is a symbol or an embodiment of the church. And the author's like, I thought the church was young. I thought the church was new. And the statement here is, no, the church has been part of God's design since creation, since beginning. So is that a good teaching, bad teaching? I don't know. I could imagine it being anti-Jewish in some extremes. But, it's this idea that the church is not this brand new thing. This is not God's plan B or plan C, but is somehow God's intention. So some interesting things in some of these books. This one's a fun one, the Gospel of Peter. So we only have fragments of this gospel. This is, we think, probably late 1st, early 2nd century. So this could be around the time of the Gospels that are in our Bible, which are also late 1st, roughly 70 to 100, I said. It might be into the 100s, the 2nd century. And we only have it beginning with Jesus being interrogated in after his arrest. So all we know about this is all that has survived, right? It's the very end of the story, from his trial forward. The resurrection scene is a little interesting in this one, right? In the night in which the Lord's day dawned, there was a loud voice in heaven. This is Sunday morning. Forget that bracket. And they saw, this is the guards at the tomb, and they saw that the heavens were opened, and that two males who had much radiance had come down from there and come near the sepulchre. But that stone which had been thrust against the door, having rolled by itself, went a distance off the side. And the sepulchre opened, and both the young men entered. So you see now this description of these angelic beings coming and walking into the tomb. Different, but similar to some of the gospel stories that we've read in recent weeks here at Westminster. And so those soldiers, having seen, awakened the centurion and the elders, for they too were present safeguarding. This sounds like Matthew's gospel. Matthew puts guards at the tomb. And while they were relating what they had seen, again, they see three males who have come out from the sepulchre. Sorry about the why. With two supporting the other one. So interesting that Jesus has got some help here, apparently, being led out of the tomb. And a cross following them. This is where it gets weird, right? There's a cross that just seems to be moving of its own accord. And the head of the two reaching into heaven, but that of the one being led out by a hand, by them going beyond the heavens. So two are staring into heaven. Somehow Jesus is staring beyond the heavens. And they were hearing a voice from the heavens saying, "Have you made proclamation to the fallen asleep?" In other words, this seems to be a reference to Jesus now going to the dead, or somebody declaring to the dead now that liberation is true. But Jesus doesn't answer, right? And the obeisance was heard from the cross, yes. So the Gospel of Peter has a walking and talking cross, which is just kind of interesting about this. You might think that's not what the canonical Gospels say, and you'd be right. So this is a really curious book, right? There's something apparently legendary in this. It would be nice to know more about it, but this is what we have from the Gospel of Peter. Moving on, some of these Gnostic writings that I talked about and tried to explain in 5 minutes, which was foolhardy. Some of these books are important to know about. There are quite a few of them, quite a lot of them. Let me point out a couple of quotes here, right? Hard to figure out which to quote. One called the Apocryphon of James, literally the secret writing of James. "So it is possible for you too to receive for yourselves heaven's domain, or heaven's kingdom, or the kingdom of heaven. Unless you receive it through knowledge, you will not be able to discover it." Right? It's for the insiders. It's for the people who get it, right? The people who have glimpsed that spark. A book called The Gospel of Truth, another one of these Gnostic writings. This one's fun to read fast. "Since the deficiency came into being because the Father was not known, therefore when the Father is known, from that moment on, the deficiency will no longer exist." In other words, what's holding you back, right? Once you know it, that's going to fix things. "As in the case of the ignorance of a person, when that person comes to have knowledge, his ignorance vanishes of itself. As the darkness vanishes when light appears, so also the deficiency vanishes in the perfection." Sounds great, right? There's something esoteric about a lot of these writings. Some of them include these reflections on the stars and some numerology and things like that as well. The Gospel of Thomas is perhaps the most well-known of a lot of these Gnostic writings. Anybody's ever heard of this or read this? There are debates about when to date it. I think early to mid-2nd century CE is about right, roughly 100, 110 to about 150-ish, somewhere in there. But again, there are significant debates about this. It claims to be written by Jesus' twin brother. Like, I didn't know he had a twin brother. Imagery of the twin, very important in a lot of Gnosticism. A lot of Gnostic writings are very dualistic. There's light and there's dark. There's truth and there's falsehood. Guess what? There's male and there's female. A lot of it is highly gendered as well. So this idea of a twin, or the reflection of somebody, right? A kind of parallel person, is very important in a lot of kind of Gnostic imagination, a lot of symbolism. So it claims to have been written by this twin, and it consists of 114 different sayings, all attributed to Jesus. It's very Gnostic in its outlook. In other words, it kind of has this idea of you need to move away from falsehood and embrace truth. Here are a couple of sayings. Saying 32, you read this and you think, well, Jesus says this in the Gospel of Matthew in the Sermon on the Mount. A city built on a high hill and fortified cannot fall, nor can it become hidden. Like, that's pretty, I get that. I can understand that one. There's also a version of the parable of the lost sheep in the Gospel of Thomas. In that version of the parable, when the shepherd brings the lost sheep home, he says something to the sheep. He says something like, I love you more than the other 99. In other words, why leave the 99 behind? Because this is a special one, right? This kind of this Gnostic understanding of there's chosen people who get it. Everybody else lives in darkness. Anybody ever seen the movie The Matrix? Remember the Keanu Reeves movie from about now probably 30 years ago? This is a great Gnostic parable, right? At the beginning, there's two pills. Choose which pill you want to take, right? This pill will put you back into your slumber and you'll live enslaved for the rest of your life. This other pill will set you free and you'll discover the truth about who you are, who humanity is, right? That's a lot of Gnosticism, right? Do you get this true inner knowledge about Jesus, about the truth of humanity? There's other sayings that are a little bit more strange. Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, these nursing babies are like those who enter God's domain or God's kingdom. They said to him, then shall we enter the Father's domain as babies? Jesus said to them, when you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, and the female be female, when you make eyes in the place of an eye, a hand in the place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter into the Father's kingdom. So we summed that up. You get that? You get some of the kind of the mystery, some of the hiddenness in a book, like the Gospel of Thomas. I mentioned that there's a lot of gender talk in the Gospel of Thomas as well. The final saying in this book, Peter is complaining because Mary Magdalene is getting too much attention from Jesus, and Jesus says to him, don't worry, Peter, I'm going to make her male so she can inherit the kingdom like the rest of us. So, sorry. There's this again, when you live in a life of dualisms, right, of these binaries, right, if there's a good side and a bad side, even gender gets put into that. And so there's this idea that for the binaries have to be healed, they have to be brought into a kind of a singularity, and the result is, one always wins. So light always triumphs, right? Truth always triumphs, male triumphs in a sense. That's not the case in all of these Gnostic writings. There are some other ones that do talk quite a bit about Mary Magdalene in particular as kind of this icon of a true disciple, which is really interesting. In some of these books, there's one called The Gospel of Mary, where the 12 disciples are always getting it wrong, and Jesus is really frustrated with them, and the only one who seems to get it right is Mary Magdalene. Which is interesting, right? Kind of shows how Mary Magdalene's legacy has lived on in the church in ways that are quite interesting. People have been fascinated with her for a long time. And there's also always been in Christianity, as far as we can tell, a kind of resistance to what the 12 apostles represent, right? To this kind of orthodox, this kind of establishment church. And a lot of these Gnostic texts are, there's other believers too. There's other believers who don't see things exactly the same way, right? Beware of falling for this monolith, right, of orthodoxy or of understanding. In the mid-2nd century, there were Gnostic Christians and what we might call today so-called Orthodox Christians, kind of people who won that battle, right? It was a significant push and pull between these various groups about whose vision of Jesus was going to win out, so to speak. We're inheritors of the so-called Orthodox group. It doesn't mean that all Gnostics were wrong or all horrible people. It just means these documents represent some streams of early Christianity that has been in some ways lost, right? Or in some ways always this kind of reminder of different ways of understanding faith, right? Different ways of understanding participation with Jesus. We could spend weeks on Gnosticism, I'd love to, but there's the infancy gospel of James, which is a hoot. So I mentioned some of these books are trying to fill in gaps in the tradition. The infancy gospel of James talks about Mary for the most part. It's very interested in, this is how we know that Mary's mother was named. Anybody know? Anne, very good. Somebody probably went to St. Anne's School for Girls somewhere, I'm guessing. It's a really important name in a lot of Catholic tradition. And what do Catholics believe about Mary's own birth? Anybody know? Immaculate conception, right? So this comes later in Catholic tradition, the belief that Mary was conceived in a way that did not pass sin along to her. In other words, what makes Mary different from everybody else in this room is that she was not born with a sinful inclination, and she was not born guilty of sin already, but lived a sinless life, which is why, again, according to some Catholic doctrine, she never dies. She's assumed into heaven. She's taken into heaven. The belief here being she had to be a perfect vessel for carrying Jesus, the Messiah. That's not necessarily what the infancy gospel of James talks about, but it does talk about Mary's conception being miraculous in that Anne, her mother, was barren. We have a lot of stories of infertility in the Bible, and so this talks about that. This also talks about the birth of Jesus, and I'm going to pick it up here with a part where Joseph is being quoted. Joseph is describing the birth of Jesus, and it's kind of funny. So here's Joseph in a panic. I saw a woman coming down from the mountain, and she said to me, "Man, where are you going?" And I said, "I'm seeking a Hebrew midwife." Replying, she said to me, "Are you from Israel?" And I said to her, "Yes." Then she said, "And who is giving birth in the cave?" This is where Mary is. She's gone into a cave. She's in labor. Joseph is, again, madly running around trying to find a midwife. And I said, "The one who has pledged to be married to me." And she said, "She's not your wife?" And I said to her, "She's Mary, the one who was raised in the temple." Oh, this is also part of the earlier story, that Anne gives birth to Mary and then hands her over to the temple, and Mary is raised there. Sounds a lot like the story of Samuel in the Older Testament. "She is not yet my wife, but has a fetus from the Holy Spirit." And the midwife said, "Really?" I just kind of like that, right? Joseph's in a panic. He's trying to explain all of this. This book also describes Joseph as being elderly and willing to marry Mary, but having absolutely no interest at all in marital relations with her. So it's just kind of funny the way that they're trying to describe how do these two people get along, and how does Mary remain, pure as she is, and who is Joseph? And Joseph said to her, "Come and see." Like he's done, trying to explain, just come. So the midwife went with him, and they stood near the cave, and a dark cloud was hovering over the cave. And the midwife said, "My soul glorifies this day, for today my eyes have seen a miracle. Salvation has come to Israel." So interesting. She just sees this cloud, recognizes the presence of God, and is now, in a sense, talking as if she understands what's going on. And immediately the cloud withdrew from the cave, and a great light appeared in the cave, so that their eyes could not bear it. And a little while later, the same light withdrew until an infant appeared, and he came and took the breast of his mother, Mary. And the midwife cried out and said, "How great is this day for me, for I have seen this new miracle." Contrast this to the Gospel of Luke, where the birth of Jesus is otherwise very, very ordinary, isn't it? Here, there's something about the birth of Jesus that nobody can even witness it, right? There's this bright light. The midwife and Joseph are both, in a sense, blinded from it. It's this holy moment that nobody can look upon. And it's not until afterwards where we get a sense, okay, Jesus is a normal baby, right? Because now he's nursing. So a really different way of kind of conceiving what is the birth of Jesus all about, right? It's too holy, you can't see it, it's happening in this cave, it's set apart. Luke's gospel, I think, is slightly different, right? Is one better or worse? I don't know, but here's a way in which an author's trying to reckon with the birth of Jesus being unlike any other birth in history, right? As far as that author can tell. I like how Joseph's just a little stressed out in this. All right, last humorous one. Maybe not humorous, kind of disturbing, actually. There are some gospels that describe Jesus as a young boy. I usually describe this as what happens when people sit with two things in their mind. One is the belief that Jesus is all-powerful and can do anything, and second, the belief that Jesus is a 12-year-old boy. What would all power look like in the hands of a 12-year-old boy? Well, we know, that's true. It's this last week, maybe we've seen that. But they do kind of wonder, was he an ordinary child? Was he a different child? What might that have looked like? These are a little disturbing. The son of Annas the scribe, this is again late 2nd century, we're now 170, 180. The son of Annas the scribe was standing there with Jesus, so this kid. Taking a branch from the willow tree, he dispersed the waters which Jesus had gathered. Previously, Jesus had basically kind of divided waters. He's just this 12-year-old kid who's bored, so he's doing miracles. And now this other kid takes this willow tree and messes with the waters. When Jesus saw what had happened, he became angry and said to him, "You godless, brainless moron. What did the ponds and waters do to you? Watch this now. You're going to dry up like a tree, and you will never produce leaves or roots or fruit." And immediately this child withered up completely. Then Jesus departed and returned to Joseph's house. The parents of the one who had been withered up, however, wailed for their young child as they took his remains away. Then they went to Joseph and accused him. "You're responsible for the child who did this." Poor Joseph. Imagine being father to the Son of God who's just a brat, right? Next, this is Jesus. He was going through the village again, and a running child bumped his shoulder. Becoming bitter, Jesus said to him, "You will not complete your journey." Immediately he fell down and died. Then some of the people who had seen what had happened said, "Where has this child come from, so that every word is a completed deed?" And going to Joseph, the parents of one who had died found fault with him. They said, "Because you have such a child, you are not allowed to live with us in the village. Or at least teach him to bless and not curse, for our children are dead." And taking his child aside, this is Joseph, he warned him, saying, "Why are you doing these things? These people are suffering and they hate us and cause trouble for us." Sorry, I know it's not funny, but it is. Then Jesus said, "I know that the words I speak are not mine. Nevertheless, I will be silent for your sake, but these people will bear their punishment." And immediately his accusers became blind. He's just this monster, right? And when they saw what he had done, they were extremely afraid and did not know what to do. And they talked about him, saying, "Every word he speaks, good or evil, is an event and becomes a miracle." When Joseph saw that Jesus had done this, however, he was outraged and took his ear and pulled it extremely hard. And the child became angry and said to him, "It is enough for you to seek and not find, but too much for you to act so unwisely. Do you not know that I am not yours? Do not trouble me." So now you know why this one's not in the Bible. Yeah, there's some weird stuff in some of these writings. And again, where does this come from? Who wrote this? We have no idea. But just interesting that somebody would imagine the power of Jesus just so viciously, right? And just so horribly. Whether this is meant to be funny, or whether this is meant to kind of refer to, again, the sinfulness of children. I think it's about, how hard it is to parent. I just feel bad for Joseph in all of these. When people get too conspiratorial and say things like, there's all these books that the church has hidden that, you don't want to come to light, that are just as good as the books in the Bible, I say, have you read the Infancy Gospel of Thomas? There's a really different Jesus in this book that's being talked about in this book. Not all of the writings that I've mentioned today are as strange or as funny or as violent or disturbing as this one. Some of them are quite pleasant and beautiful as well. But, when you're just doing one slide per, you got to keep the audience engaged. All right, so where are all these books hiding? Are they in the library of the Vatican? Are they in somebody's basement? Where are they? They're on the web. So nobody's keeping them secret. If you want to read any of these, the best website to go to is earlychristianwritings.com. It's the website looks like it was designed about 20 years ago. And it has texts there. It has old, again, translations of these texts. So a lot of the English is a little bit archaic. This is only some of it. I couldn't fit it all into a single screenshot. You'll see it has New Testament writings there. As well. But a couple of cautions. One is the date. Some of the hypotheses about dating of these documents on this website are all over the map, and some of it's a little bit skewed as well. Also, this website, you might look at this and think oh, okay. I see on here, for example, what can we look at? 200 to 230, the three steles of Seth. I don't even know what that is. Comparing that to Second Clement, for example. Second Clement, you've got significant literature that we've got multiple copies of that's quoted by other church teachers. You've also got literature on here that is just really fragmentary, and we don't know a whole lot about where it came from or what it's for. In other words, it presents everything as like, here's this library, but this consists of a variety of documents found in a variety of places. So that's my caution. Also, just because we have a document that says something doesn't mean that everybody believed it back in the ancient world. So don't read something and say, hey, all Christians in the 2nd century thought X. Again, some of this is a little bit bizarre literature. The question you've been asking for now 55 minutes, why am I here, right? So what? What can we learn from this? First, and I mentioned this earlier, I think it was in response to Sheila's comment about like movies today, for example, that we might make movies about Jesus today or write novels about Jesus today that don't give new historical information about Jesus, but they sure tell a lot about what we're interested in today, the kinds of things we talk about. A lot of this literature, when it comes to Jesus and the life of Jesus, doesn't really give us information about Jesus that has a lot of reliability, a lot of trustworthiness from the perspective of a historical reconstruction. But it tells us a lot about what people in these days were worried about, fighting about, interested in, dreaming about. Does that make sense? So when people are saying things like, well, there's some 2nd century documents where Jesus and Mary Magdalene seem to have a very close relationship, I would say, well, we also know that from the biblical Gospels. These just might be magnifying that. Those books don't necessarily prove certain things about conversations Jesus and Mary might have had, but those documents certainly show us in the 2nd century, people are really interested in this question of, did Jesus have other followers besides the 12 men that he invested time in, that he trusted, and so on and so forth? Does that make sense? So when we say today, we need to recover the fact that there were women in Jesus' life who were followers, not just 12 guys. That's not just a modern invention, right? We've got other ancient Christians who were worried about that as well, or who were interested in that, and who knew traditions about that. Whether that means we can reconstruct actual conversations, I don't think we have enough information to do that. That's the second bullet point that I just said. The third thing to note is that the history of Christian thinking about Jesus has always been diverse. Like my anecdote about my student who was like, I just want to study the time when Christians all agreed. This is part of what it means to be a person of faith, to like have different points of view in our midst. Theological development and clarity does not proceed in a straight line. The church makes mistakes. You probably know that already. We can name some modern ones as well as some ancient ones. When that happens, we correct, right? We course correct, we repent, we do that. In some ways in these writings, we see people working out their beliefs. We need to recognize that sometimes if we find anger in some of these books, or a desire to write some people out of the story, sometimes that's because they're coming in a very, very acrimonious time, right? You say things in the midst of a disagreement, right, that might be firmer. You say things sometimes to your family members you would never say to a stranger in terms of how you navigate your disagreements, right, with one another. So beware of that. And remember, we're part of long-standing and continuing conversations, right? The church is not this monolith of we know the answers to everything. The church is a collection of people who continue to talk about who is God, how is God known, what bears witness to God, what literature helps us with that. Whew. This was a lot. I realized this week I'd made a huge mistake in promising to do all of this in one day, but can't go back on your word. So we've got 2 microphones, which are helpful, and it's 10:14. If people need to run, I fully understand.
I have 3 brothers.
Yes.
And so I see that, that last statement of what Jesus was saying to these kids sounds like things that my brothers would say to each other. So I guess I can see where that comes from. So yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Right, yeah. I mean, I think of things I said and did when I was 12 years old with my 12-year-old friends, and I hope none of that ever comes to life. Fortunately, none of us had the power to, In that book, he does nice things, too. Like, he makes little birds out of clay and claps his hands, and they fly away. He creates things, but Usually when he's with other people, he ends up being violent. Over here? Yes. Oh, sorry. It's a wide room.
I was intrigued with the account of Jesus' birth in that the infancy, was it Infancy Gospel of James?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things that was intriguing was that when I was raised in the Catholic Church and I went to parochial school, and I remember a nun who said at one point, Jesus came to Mary as a ray of light, not born the same way. And I thought, that is really interesting. If that somehow became a tradition that kind of flowed along with everything else. Any sense of how that continues in like modern traditions?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Catholic teaching to be too confident about that. But that book, that Infancy Gospel of James, was part of the conversation for a lot of Catholic Marian traditions around, especially around like the sinlessness of Mary. Right, once you believe that sin is passed on through procreation, through sex and childbirth, if that's what you believe, I don't personally believe that, but that was the teaching of the church, the Catholic Church for some time. Then you've got a problem if you want a sinless Jesus, because then you need a sinless mother, right? And so God has to intervene in some ways then and there. And then you've got questions around, for example, the perpetual virginity of Mary, right? Was she ever a mother to other children? I mean, things that, again, the church historically invested a lot of worrying in. I'm not so personally worried about, but that book, the Infancy Gospel of James, shows some of that same kind of concern, so to speak. Like, don't worry, Mary was a pure mother. Don't worry, Jesus' birth. I remember Amy Mar-